For a few seconds, it looked like just another lighthearted morning on live television. Laughter rolled across the studio. The audience relaxed. And then, with one unexpected turn in the conversation, the mood shifted in a way no one could rewind, cut, or soften, because this was happening live. Subscribe to The Truth Narrator, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What unfolded on that episode of The View was not a shouting match, not a viral meltdown, and not a scripted clash. It was something far more subtle, and in many ways more revealing. A moment where humor brushed up against seriousness. Where a celebrity known for charm was caught navigating a question that landed differently than expected. And where a veteran talk show host reminded everyone that live television has a way of exposing truth without raising its voice. The headline would later read as a contrast: Paul Rudd versus Joy Behar, laughter turns serious. But to understand why this moment mattered, you have to slow down and look carefully at what actually happened, second by second, in front of millions of viewers. Morning talk shows thrive on rhythm. There's banter, applause, predictable beats. Guests arrive knowing roughly how things will go. The hosts know how to keep it moving. And audiences expect comfort more than confrontation. That's especially true when the guest is someone like Paul Rudd, an actor whose public image is built on approachability, humor, and an almost universal likability. He's not known for controversy. He's known for making people laugh without making waves. That reputation mattered. Because when someone like Paul Rudd sits down at the table on The View, expectations are set before a single word is spoken. The assumption is ease. Smiles. A few jokes. Maybe a light political aside, but nothing sharp enough to change the temperature in the room. And for the opening moments of this interview, that assumption seemed safe. Joy Behar, on the other hand, is not a host who operates only on ease. Decades on television have given her a reputation for wit that can cut just as cleanly as it entertains. She understands timing. She understands live audiences. And she understands that sometimes the most revealing moments don't come from aggressive questioning, but from asking something straightforward and letting silence do the work. That dynamic between an affable guest and a seasoned host is what made this segment so compelling in retrospect. Because there was no warning sign, no raised voices, no producer stepping in. Just a moment where humor and seriousness crossed paths on live TV, and neither side could fully control where the conversation went next. Live television removes safety nets. There's no editing room, no second takes. Reactions are real because they have to be. And when something unexpected happens, it's not the words alone that matter. It's posture, eye contact, timing. The small pauses that say more than any statement ever could. This was one of those moments. At first, the conversation moved exactly as viewers expected. Laughter came easily. The audience responded warmly. Paul Rudd leaned into the charm that has defined his career, offering light responses and playful energy. Joy Behar matched him beat for beat, her humor landing cleanly, the exchange feeling effortless. To anyone watching casually, it looked like another successful celebrity appearance. But beneath that surface, there was something else at play. Talk shows like The View are not just promotional stops. They are cultural mirrors. The questions asked and the way they're answered reflect larger conversations happening outside the studio. And sometimes a question that sounds simple carries more weight than the guest anticipates. What made this particular moment stand out wasn't shock. It was contrast. The shift from laughter to seriousness happened quietly, almost politely. And that's precisely why it landed so strongly with viewers. Because when a room full of people senses that the tone has changed, even without being told, attention sharpens. For Paul Rudd, the challenge wasn't hostility. It was recalibration. Navigating a moment where the expectations of a light interview suddenly brushed up against something more grounded. For Joy Behar, it was about maintaining control of a live broadcast while allowing an honest exchange to unfold in real time. And for the audience, both in the studio and at home, it was a reminder of why live television still matters in an era of edited clips and curated personas. Because sometimes truth doesn't arrive with drama. Sometimes it arrives in a pause. This wasn't about humiliation or exposure in the tabloid sense. It was about authenticity under pressure. About how even the most polished public figures respond when the script subtly changes. And about how a single question, asked at the right moment, can momentarily pull back the curtain on the difference between performance and reality. As the conversation continued, the smiles didn't disappear, but they shifted. The laughter didn't stop, but it softened. And in that space between words, viewers witnessed something unscripted and undeniably human. What exactly was asked? How did Paul Rudd respond in the moment? And why did so many viewers later describe this segment as a turning point in tone rather than content? That's where the story truly begins. Long before the cameras rolled that morning, the interview had already been shaped by years of public perception. Carefully built images that both the guest and the host carried with them into the studio. Paul Rudd arrived at The View with one of the most stable reputations in modern Hollywood. His career had been marked by consistency rather than controversy. From mainstream comedies to blockbuster franchises, he had cultivated an image that felt unusually safe in an era where celebrity missteps often dominate headlines. He was known as someone who avoided extremes, politically careful, personally private, and publicly agreeable. That reputation didn't happen by accident. Over the years, Paul Rudd had mastered a specific kind of public presence. Charming without being evasive, humorous without being reckless, and thoughtful without being polarizing. On talk shows, he rarely disrupted the flow. He didn't challenge hosts. He didn't provoke audiences. He played the role expected of him, and did it well. And that's exactly why this appearance felt so predictable going in. For The View, predictability is both an asset and a liability. The show thrives on conversation, not confrontation, but it also exists at the intersection of entertainment and real-world discourse. Guests come to promote projects, but the hosts are there to contextualize those projects within larger cultural conversations. That balance is delicate. Most of the time, it's managed smoothly. Occasionally, it produces tension. Joy Behar had been navigating that balance for decades. By the time this interview took place, she was no longer just a co-host. She was an institution within the format. Her style was unmistakable. She relied on humor, but it was rarely harmless. Her jokes carried subtext. Her questions often sounded casual, while aiming directly at the core of an issue. Importantly, Joy Behar was not known for ambushing guests. She didn't raise her voice or stage confrontations for shock value. Instead, she used timing. A pause. A follow-up. A carefully phrased sentence delivered with a smile that made it easy to underestimate where the conversation might go. In the days leading up to the interview, there was no visible controversy attached to Paul Rudd. He wasn't there to defend himself. He wasn't responding to backlash. On paper, this was a straightforward promotional stop, one of many he had done throughout his career. That context matters because it explains why the shift in tone felt so noticeable once it happened. The show itself had been operating within a familiar rhythm. Recent episodes followed the expected pattern. Topical discussions, guest appearances, light debate, occasional humor that leaned political but stayed within bounds. The audience knew what to expect. The producers knew how to pace the segment. And Paul Rudd likely knew the general outline of the conversation before he sat down. But live television has a way of stretching beyond outlines. There's an unspoken understanding between guests and hosts on daytime talk shows. The guest offers openness within reason. The host pushes gently, but not recklessly. Most of the time, both sides stay within that shared understanding. When that balance shifts, even slightly, it becomes visible immediately. What made this situation unique was that the tension didn't come from disagreement. It came from framing. Joy Behar's approach that day was subtle. She didn't signal confrontation. She didn't preface her question with warnings or qualifiers. Instead, she built the conversation slowly, grounding it in humor and familiarity. That setup mattered, because when seriousness eventually entered the discussion, it didn't feel abrupt, it felt earned. For Paul Rudd, this meant navigating a moment where his usual tools, timing, humor, charm, had to work harder. Not because the question was aggressive, but because it carried implications that extended beyond the studio. It touched on how public figures are perceived, on how neutrality is interpreted, on how silence, even when unintentional, can be read as a statement. The pressure in moments like this isn't explosive. It's quiet, and that quiet is often more revealing. Audience members later described sensing the shift before they could articulate it. The laughter became lighter. The energy at the table changed. The hosts leaned in slightly, not physically, but conversationally. These are details that don't register immediately, but they accumulate. Behind the scenes, producers are trained to watch for exactly these moments. They know when a conversation is drifting into territory that can't be easily redirected. But on live television, intervention is limited. Once a question is asked and answered, it exists. Permanently. And that's the core tension of this story. Paul Rudd wasn't unprepared in the traditional sense. He had answered thousands of questions on live TV. But preparation assumes predictability. It assumes that tone will remain consistent. It assumes that humor will remain the dominant language of the exchange. Joy Behar understood that assumption. And rather than breaking it outright, she bent it. As the interview progressed, the conversation edged closer to a moment that would later be replayed, discussed, and analyzed. Not because of what was said loudly, but because of what was allowed to linger. The pause before a response. The measured tone of the answer. The realization, visible if you were paying attention, that this wasn't just another promotional stop anymore. Nothing had gone wrong yet. No lines had been crossed. But the atmosphere had shifted enough to make everyone aware that something meaningful was about to happen. And when it did, there would be no edits. No rewrites. Just live television, doing what it has always done best, revealing truth in real time. The moment arrived without ceremony. There was no dramatic music cue, no visible signal to the audience that something important was about to happen. The conversation simply shifted, one sentence flowing into the next, until it reached a question that subtly altered the balance of the room. On live television, timing is everything. And this question landed at a moment when the laughter had just faded enough for seriousness to be felt. Joy Behar leaned forward slightly, her tone calm, almost conversational. There was no edge in her voice, no sign of confrontation. The question itself was framed simply, rooted in a broader cultural discussion rather than a personal accusation. But it carried weight because it touched on responsibility, visibility, and the expectations placed on public figures in moments of national conversation. The studio went quiet, not abruptly, not awkwardly, just enough that the absence of laughter became noticeable. Paul Rudd paused. That pause, barely a few seconds long, did more than any reaction shot could have. His expression remained composed, but the rhythm he had been operating in shifted. The easy back and forth that defined the earlier part of the interview slowed. His eyes moved briefly, not in discomfort, but in recalibration. This was no longer a space for reflexive humor. Because this was live. No editing would soften the response. No post-production could remove the silence that now hung in the air. Paul Rudd answered carefully. His words were measured, thoughtful, and restrained. He didn't deflect the question, but he didn't lean into it either. The response acknowledged the topic without fully claiming it, navigating a narrow line between engagement and neutrality. As he spoke, the body language around the table told its own story. Joy Behar listened intently, her expression neutral, her posture still. She didn't interrupt. She didn't challenge the response immediately. That choice mattered. By allowing the answer to stand on its own, she let the audience absorb it without guidance. The other hosts remained quiet. No jokes. No side comments. Just attention. In live television, silence can feel louder than words. And this silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was attentive. The kind of quiet that signals to viewers that something meaningful is unfolding, even if they can't immediately explain why. Paul Rudd finished his answer. There was a brief moment where it seemed like the conversation might pivot back to safer ground. But the energy had already changed. The laughter that followed was polite, not spontaneous. The rhythm had been disrupted. Joy Behar responded, not with confrontation, but with a follow-up that gently reframed the conversation. Again, the tone remained calm. But the implication was clear. This wasn't about catching someone off guard. It was about placing a spotlight on how public figures navigate moments that don't come with scripts. Paul Rudd nodded. He smiled slightly. But this smile was different from the ones earlier in the interview. Less performative. More restrained. Viewers at home might not have consciously registered every detail in real time. But collectively, they felt it. The shift from entertainment to reflection. From banter to awareness. From expectation to uncertainty. And because this was happening on The View, a platform known for its cultural relevance, the moment didn't dissipate once the segment moved on. It lingered. No one raised their voice. No one accused. No one walked off set. Yet something had undeniably occurred. This was the power of live television at its most understated, revealing not conflict, but contrast. The contrast between a carefully maintained public persona and the unpredictable nature of real-time conversation. Between preparation and presence. Between humor as armor and thoughtfulness as response. As the conversation continued, the hosts gradually steered the discussion forward. The segment didn't end abruptly. There was no visible fallout yet, but the tone never fully returned to what it had been before that question. And for viewers who recognized the shift, one thing was clear. This was a moment that would be talked about not because of outrage, but because of its restraint. Stay with the truth, narrator, because what happened next, after the cameras kept rolling, changed how this exchange was understood entirely. When the conversation moved on, the shift was subtle, but irreversible. On the surface, the segment continued as planned. The hosts redirected the discussion. The cadence of the show resumed. Smiles returned to the table, and the audience responded when prompted. But the atmosphere in the studio was no longer the same as it had been just minutes earlier. On live television, energy doesn't reset instantly. It carries. The view is designed to feel conversational, but it is also meticulously timed. Every minute matters. After the exchange, the producers did what live producers always do in moments like this. They allowed the show to move forward without drawing attention to what had just occurred. No recap, no acknowledgement, no attempt to underline the moment. That choice alone spoke volumes. In the studio, the audience sensed it. Applause came, but it was more restrained. Laughter surfaced, but it didn't spill over the way it had earlier. Viewers often underestimate how attuned live audiences are to tonal shifts. When something meaningful happens, even quietly, people feel it collectively. Joy Behar maintained her composure throughout. She didn't press further. She didn't circle back to the question. Instead, she allowed the segment to breathe and then gently guided the conversation onward. This wasn't avoidance, it was control. For a host with decades of experience, knowing when not to push is just as important as knowing when to ask. Her handling of the moment became part of the story. By not escalating, she allowed the exchange to stand on its own merit. The audience wasn't told how to feel about what they'd just seen. They were trusted to interpret it themselves. Paul Rudd, for his part, remained present and professional. There was no visible defensiveness, no visible frustration, but the ease that defined his earlier demeanor didn't fully return. His responses stayed thoughtful. His tone stayed measured. The charm was still there, but it had been recalibrated. This wasn't damage control. It was adaptation. One of the most telling aspects of the aftermath was what didn't happen. There was no interruption from producers. No cut to commercial mid-thought. No sudden change in seating or camera angles. The show trusted its audience to stay with the conversation, even after the tonal shift. That trust is rare and revealing. As the segment wrapped, the closing remarks felt slightly more formal than usual. The warmth remained, but it was tempered. When the applause came, it signaled completion rather than celebration. The interview had concluded, but the moment itself had not resolved. It lingered. Outside the studio, the ripple effects began almost immediately. Clips circulated online, not in explosive viral form, but in measured discussion. Commentators didn't frame the exchange as a confrontation. Instead, they focused on the nuance, the restraint, the pause, the way a single question altered the dynamic of a seemingly routine interview. What stood out to many viewers was how normal the moment looked, and how uncommon that normality felt. There were no theatrics, no outrage, just a reminder that live television can still create space for unscripted reflection. In media analysis, moments like this are often overlooked because they don't fit the usual patterns of conflict-driven virality. But for those paying attention, they reveal something deeper about how public figures operate under pressure. Paul Rudd didn't stumble. He didn't say the wrong thing. But he was momentarily placed in a position where expectations collided, with the expectations of the show, the audience, and the cultural moment surrounding the question. Joy Behar didn't attack. She didn't accuse. But she demonstrated the power of framing, how asking the right question at the right time can change the entire tone of a conversation without raising its volume. And The View did what live television has always done best when it's working properly. It allowed reality to unfold without interference. In the hours that followed, there was no official statement, no clarification, no attempt to reshape the narrative. That absence was telling. The moment didn't require explanation, it required reflection. For some viewers, the exchange reinforced their appreciation for Paul Rudd's thoughtfulness. For others, it highlighted the limitations of carefully managed public personas. And for many, it simply stood as a reminder that even the most polished interviews can shift unexpectedly when real questions are asked in real time. What changed instantly wasn't public opinion in any dramatic sense. It was perception. The interview was no longer just a promotional appearance. It had become a reference point, a moment people pointed to when discussing how celebrities respond to pressure without spectacle, how hosts can challenge without confrontation, and how live television still holds the power to reveal authenticity, not through chaos, but through calm. That calm, paradoxically, is what made the moment last. And as the days passed, it became clear that this exchange would be remembered not for what was said loudly, but for what was revealed quietly. In the weeks that followed, the interview settled into a familiar modern pattern. Not explosive, not fleeting, but quietly persistent. There were no apology tours, no damage control interviews, no headline screaming scandal. Instead, the moment lived on in commentary, analysis, and subtle reference. Media critics pointed to it not as a controversy, but as an example, an illustration of how live television can still produce meaning without spectacle. For Paul Rudd, the long-term impact wasn't about reputation loss. His public image remained largely intact, supported by years of consistency and trust with audiences. If anything, the exchange added dimension. It reminded viewers that even the most affable celebrities are navigating complex expectations in real time, often without clear instructions on how to respond. What stood out was how he handled the moment without retreat or overcorrection. He didn't try to reframe the narrative afterward. He didn't issue clarifications through publicists. By allowing the moment to exist as it happened, he demonstrated a quiet confidence that resonated with many viewers. In an era where every perceived misstep is often followed by elaborate explanations, restraint became its own statement. For Joy Behar, the segment reinforced a reputation she had spent decades shaping. Not as a provocateur, but as a conversationalist who understands the power of timing. Analysts noted that the strength of the exchange came not from the question alone, but from how it was delivered, and how she allowed the response to stand without escalation. This approach matters in the broader landscape of talk television. As formats increasingly chase viral moments, there is pressure to manufacture conflict. But this interview demonstrated an alternative, that meaningful television can emerge from respect, patience, and a willingness to let silence speak. The show itself, The View, benefited from that distinction. The segment was cited in discussions about the program's enduring relevance. Not because it shocked audiences, but because it reflected the kind of nuanced discourse that originally defined the format. It showed that the table could still function as a place for real conversation, even when that conversation becomes unexpectedly serious. Culturally, the moment landed at a time when audiences were increasingly skeptical of polished media appearances. Viewers had grown accustomed to carefully curated narratives, whether on social platforms or in traditional interviews. Against that backdrop, a moment that felt unscripted, even understated, stood out. What made it last wasn't outrage. It was relatability. People recognized the feeling of being asked a serious question in a light setting. The instinct to pause, to choose words carefully, to balance honesty with awareness. That human response bridged the gap between celebrity and audience in a way that louder moments often fail to do. Media scholars later pointed to the exchange as an example of soft confrontation, a technique where accountability is introduced without hostility. In this framework, the host doesn't dominate the conversation. Instead, they create space for reflection and allow the audience to draw conclusions independently. That's why this moment continues to matter. It reminds us that exposure doesn't always look like conflict. Sometimes it looks like clarity, a brief alignment between question and context that reveals more than intended, not because someone was forced, but because they were seen thinking in real time. For future guests, the interview served as a quiet lesson. Preparation matters, but presence matters more. Humor can open doors, but it can't always close them. And live television, despite its predictability, will always carry the possibility of the unexpected. For viewers, it reaffirmed something essential, that not every meaningful media moment needs to be loud to be lasting. In fact, the ones that linger longest are often the ones that trust the audience to pay attention. As time passes, this exchange continues to be referenced not as a clash, but as a turning point in tone. A reminder of what happens when laughter gives way to thought, and when live television does exactly what it's supposed to do. If moments like this matter to you, If you value careful storytelling, real-time truth, and the subtle power of unscripted television, subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, share it with others, and tell us in the comments what this moment meant to you. Because sometimes, the most revealing stories aren't the ones that explode. They're the ones that quietly endure.